Back in 2006, a decade ago, I took the position that studying at a university in the English-speaking world is the worst idea imaginable and that youngsters should avoid the universities altogether, or if they really wanted, they should probably try German universities or technical universities from the former Eastern Bloc. Now, needless to say, I got a little bit of a backlash for such a bold position, especially in 2006 when the degeneration process wasn't really so obvious. Now, for a while, I even considered that maybe I was a bit too radical, that maybe I should nuance things a little bit further. But in the last 2 years, it has become blatantly obvious that I wasn't too radical, but rather too moderate. All universities in Europe and North America should be avoided and allowed to go bankrupt on themselves until new university establishments emerge and intellectual honesty and rigor is returned. Something which is likely to happen during the lifetime of exactly and nobody watching this video, so for all intents and purposes, universities ought to be declared no-go zones, or anti-intellectual spaces. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Freedom Alternative Research and Analysis. Alright, this one is going to be a bit long because there's quite a little bit to cover. Now, before saying anything, let's look at two articles that emerged in the last 10, 12 days, whatever, that, in my view, say everything that needs to be said about the degeneration of the academia. Now, first one is this little nugget from the Telegraph. Universities have always been a safe space for straight white men. Censorship just evens the playing field. This is that kind of article that tends to get worse with every line you go deeper into it. So let's read a bit, shall we? Quote, "Pity the poor university student. Thanks to safe spaces and trigger warnings, no platforming and PC hogwash, they're being turned from rigorous intellectual thinkers into delicate hothouse flowers, and in doing so, they've been barred from a grand tradition of academia that stretches back for centuries. Free speech." Yes, the very same freedom women have only been enjoying for a little over a century. According to newly published research from the Higher Education Policy Institute, more women than men think universities should safeguard people of a particular gender, race, or sexuality against offensive views. Or, depending on where you get your news, female students are pro-censorship. There's an ugly subtext to this argument, that all the people complaining about the right to a safe space just don't understand what university is. After all, it wasn't designed for them. But what critics of this censorship are failing to bear in mind is that freedom of expression has historically been limited for women, LGBTQ people, and people of color. Now, okay, let's stop right here for a moment. Now, when reading such garbage, we could go on the intellectual route and remind the opposition that people such as Oscar Wilde did exist. And while it is true and regrettable that such individuals were prosecuted and, yes, persecuted for their sexual preferences, it is not true that their freedom of expression was generally limited. After all, if that had been true, how the hell can we still enjoy their work today, and how the hell did these people become famous during their lifetimes to begin with? Now, if you want to see what actual limitations on freedom of expression look like, historically speaking, now try finding the writings of the people who were declared Soviet non-persons during the reign of Stalin. And then please do come back to me and try to argue that they're somehow equivalent. The same goes for women, about whom modern progressives would have us believe were always oppressed and lacking freedom of expression, a belief which essentially denies the accomplishments of the virtuous women of the 18th and 19th century who had more than these things but had to, earn them. Just like men. So we could do that, but why should we? No, serious question. Why should we? Because from where I'm standing, the academia is so bloody foregone that it is no longer worth trying to save it. Because any person who's been paying attention in the last several years knows damn well that views such as the one I quoted from are not the exception, but rather the absolute norm, both amongst the students and especially amongst the professorial class. And in a way, the progressive bimbo I quoted is quite correct. The university was not created for them. It's just that them does not refer to women, non-straights or whatever, but it refers to progressives specifically, regardless of their personal identity. But let's read a bit more, because this article is really insightful not for its content, but for its chilling honesty. Now, you don't see that too often in Marxist feminists. So, quote, "Free speech is hard to access when someone is shouting over you. If I was a trans student, tackling the constant microaggressions and threats of assault that come along with that, the last thing I'd want is for my university, to which students are being asked to pay higher and higher fees, to give a platform to someone who makes a living stirring up hatred against people like me." Wah. When the NUS no-platformed writer and feminist Julie Bindel, as it was felt her views could incite hatred towards and exclusion of our trans students, it was a triumph of trans inclusivity. Every time Milo Yiannopoulos is prevented from taking his misogynistic views into a public space, harassing women on the student union dime, that's one less piece of sexist crap female students have to deal with. 1 in 4 students want UKIP banned from speaking on campus? Good! UKIP are an embarrassment of a party with policies that bear zero relation to reality. If students at any university, from Red Brick to former Poly, were welcoming them with open arms because they thought their views contained the same rigor and critical thought as the main parties, they should get a tuition fee refund. Now, that's progressivism for you. You see, when I say that progressivism is a societal cancer, a slogan that I used to have as an intro at the beginning of this channel, when I say that, I'm not saying it because I want to be witty or because I want to make anyone laugh. I'm saying it because it is the truth. And in order to treat cancer, the ill part sometimes needs to be extirpated. And that's precisely why I think universities should be extirpated from the rest of the society and let them eat themselves out and collapse under the weight of all the trigger warnings and inclusivity and whatever other nonsense they may come up with. And I know some of you will say that the disintegration process of the NUS is ongoing because there's already enough people within the system who are simply sick and tired of their shenanigans. But I will say that's just postponing the inevitable result. Just, kicking the can down the road for a little bit more. Like the Keynesians do whenever economic reality catches up with their fantasies. And this can only be done for a limited amount of times. At one point, one will have to face reality, that the universities are FUBAR. And while in the past it can be argued that it was a bunch of ideologues who gradually meddled in with the curricula and that the extracurricular activities such as the no-platformed events aren't really that relevant, now it's up to the point where the students demand this. Here's an example from June 1. Yale English students call for end of focus on white male writers. Undergraduates press for compulsory course on canonical poets to be decolonized. Let's read a bit, shall we? Quote, "Undergraduates at Yale University have launched a petition calling on the English department to abolish a core course requirement to study canonical writers including Chaucer, Shakespeare and Milton, saying that it is unacceptable that a Yale student considering studying English literature might read only white male authors. The prestigious Connecticut University requires its English majors to spend 2 semesters studying a selection of authors it labels the major English poets. But students have launched a petition calling on Yale to decolonize the course. They want the university to abolish the major English poets requirement and to refocus the course's pre-1800-1900 requirements to, quote, deliberately include literatures relating to gender, race, sexuality, ableism, and ethnicity. The petition says that, quote, a year spent around the seminar table where the literary contributions of women, people of color, and queer folk are absent actively harms all students regardless of their identity, and that the course, quote, creates a culture that is especially hostile to students of color, end quote. Some members of Yale's English faculty welcomed the student activism. Professor Jill Richards told the Yale Daily News that, quote, it is unacceptable that the 2-semester requirement for all majors routinely covers the work of 8 white male poets. But the petition drew criticism from former members of the university. Now, do you notice a pattern here? The professors and the students are more than happy to indulge in this degeneration process, whilst the former members, be they retired, former students, alumni, and so on and so forth, are appalled because they remember the saner period of their university. And mind you, the universities outside of the Anglosphere are getting worse and worse and worse as well. It's just that they're slightly behind the degeneration curve. Now, 15 years ago, it was unheard of Marxist or Trotskyist or whatever communist student unions to try to kick out lecturers. Heck, even 5 years ago, it was still unheard of anywhere in continental Europe. Today, it's happening more and more often. Now, sure, it's still not that often as it is in the Anglosphere, and that's partly because continental Europe doesn't have these gated campuses all over the place, thus making it a little bit harder for progressivists to propagate their poison amongst the student body. But you don't give it time. 15, 20 years from now, trigger warnings will be in a university next to everyone watching this video, no matter where you are. It will spread eventually, because it is a disease, and the only way to stop such a disease is to cut the evil from its roots, which is why the abandonment of the academia is preferable. Now, nobody is saying that the buildings should be burned down or anything like that. No. Just stop supporting them. Don't donate to them. Don't send your child to them. And if your child refuses the advice and wants to go anyway, don't fund their tuition at all, and generally refuse to do anything that might potentially help a university. Now, whenever I say this, I'm usually greeted with the nauseating slogan that, oh, but a degree is the path to the middle class, or some variation of that sort. The problem is that that slogan is no longer true. It used to be true back in the days when there was an actual selection on who gets to go to college, and it used to be the case that not every schmuck could go to college and expect to graduate. Now that's increasingly less and less the case. Wherever you look, especially in the so-called liberal arts, but also increasingly in some corridors of the STEM, the curricula is so dumbed down that it becomes very hard to distinguish between secondary school curricula, university curricula, and mental asylums. Now, as the disease of progressivism, progresses, more and more programs tend to have a curricula based on a mixture of formerly secondary school curricula and mental asylum. Now, I'll leave a few examples of that in the low bar. And the market is slowly but surely starting to adapt to the new normal. And the new normal is that the best candidates for a job are increasingly autodidacts or generally people who don't have any degree of any kind. And while the media treats this as some sort of a bizarre phenomenon, it's not really bizarre. It's how the future will look like, much sooner than many dare to think right now. And it's really logical when you think about it for a little bit. When the costs of actual studying have become so high and everyone has a degree in some bollocks studies whilst at the same time being largely dumb as a rock, why in the world would you, as an employer, limit yourself to those holding degrees? Also, there is a new generation of employers out there who tended to drop studying altogether and open their own firms. Now sure, not all of them succeeded, but those that eventually did succeed do compare with how their well-educated colleagues fared. And they noticed what I've been noticing for the last 10 years, that a wall full of diplomas is rarely a guarantee for competence. Basically, the only thing still keeping the university industry somewhat afloat is the overregulation of the economy. But economic reality will de facto abolish that, again, much sooner than many would dare to think at this point. I mean, look at architecture, for instance. One of the most influential neo-traditional architects and planners, Luxembourg-born architect Leon Krier, a laureate of the Richard Driehaus Prize for Achievement in the Art of Classical Architecture, is actually an autodidact. In fact, the architecture profession is filled with autodidacts. You know what the architecture graduates do? Well, they work for the autodidacts. Now sure, that's not the case, not always, not everywhere, but broadly speaking, even the profession of architecture, which is one of the most regulated professions, thanks to state-endowed privileges of various architects' orders and unions, even here, there's a plethora of people with no formal degrees, but who nonetheless excelled and continue to excel on the market. Look, for instance, at other fields such as IT or telecommunications. Scores of individuals with either no degree of any kind or individuals with degrees in completely unrelated fields who generally regret spending the time and money on them to begin with. This is going to increasingly be the case in more and more fields as the education per se becomes less and less costly outside of the highly regulated confines of the formal education industry. You can learn almost anything either entirely for free or for a fraction of the official cost, thanks to the internet. The academic establishment looks at this phenomenon with either with fear, because they know that their cushy positions will be the first to go, or they look at this and they're in complete denial. I mean, I've actually met academics who are completely convinced that their bollocks course in the, let's say, history of European integration not only is badly needed for the economy today, but will continue to be many decades to follow. Such detachment from reality can only be attributed to a high propensity towards magical thinking. Or maybe it's something else, I really don't know, but only magical thinking can explain, to me at least, this refusal of otherwise quite well-educated and smart people to understand a little bit about their surroundings. So, to sum up, universities will become more and more progressive unless they'll start feeling some market pressure. Now, my recommended course of action is to simply abandon them altogether. Just shun them from the rest of us. I personally made a policy of my own to never employ anyone who graduated from a university that is to the west of Germany later than 2005. Sooner or later, it will become a stain on one's resume to have graduated from a socialist hellhole like DePaul or UCLA or Sorbonne or whatever. And it is already irrelevant in an increasing number of professions whether you have a degree or not. So if you are college age, think twice or thrice on whether it is actually worth going to college to begin with. Is it worth going to swallow progressivist nonsense and pay for that on top of it and then derive no significant benefit? Because unless you want to become a medical doctor or a cutting-edge scientist in, let's say, microbiology or physics, the case for going to college is really, really thin. And it's getting increasingly thinner. Also, even researchers without a degree are also becoming more common as more and more private establishments emerge. Now, in the past, it used to be the case that universities had the tools to facilitate research, so you'd go there not necessarily for the degree, but for the potential access to the university's research facilities. We're still not there yet to have fully privatized research, and probably universities will still be useful for this aspect alone. In fact, back in the days, before progressivism, that's what universities used to be. Places where you'd go to learn how to learn and or practice something until you master it. But you see, none of that matters now. What does matter is that if you want to seriously undermine progressivism, the best course of action is to cut the funding of its source, which is the academia. Now, I know it sounds harsh, and yes, there are trade-offs with that, but it's a far more efficient tactic over the long run than to actually fight academic progressives at this point. Besides, the fight is unfair to begin with. I mean, we, as non-progressives, pay these schmucks with our taxes, then pay them again if we commit the colossal mistake of sending our children to their indoctrination camps, and then pay them again with when their sorry-ass degrees obviously don't help them in any way, shape, or form, and then they end up, on government assistance. I would say it's just simply time to end this cycle. But hey, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I am too radical on this. So please, do tell me if you think I'm wrong, and specifically, where and how do you think I'm wrong? Or maybe, I'm just too cynical at this point and simply have no faith anymore that the universities can even be fixed, and this degeneration process, I don't think it can be halted or reversed anymore. But then again, maybe you do see something that I don't. So yeah, let's discuss this because it really does matter. Now, in the event you're seeing this as I am in my tour of Ukraine, I'll be reading and replying the comments, of course, when I come back. Anyway, with that said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.